Brooklyn. FTC fights mass evictions, fraudulent rent increases schemes, and the two common tactics of harassment. Today, it's a great honor for me to honor Flatbush Tenant Coalitions for the Housing Justice Award.
Yes, Miranda, we'll do your photo op.
Bush is in the house. No.
Well, it is a great honor to accept this award honoring the Flatbush Tenant Coalition for our work advocating for tenants in our community and beyond. We are a member-led group of tenant associations in Flatbush, East Flatbush, and South Crown Heights, working collectively building tenant power. Over the past year, we have worked tirelessly with Housing Court Answers and other groups on the right to counsel, which provides tenants who cannot afford it with legal representation in housing court. Our Stronger Rent Laws campaign engages tenants in seeking support from elected officials in this long fight to get the rent laws strengthened that are due to expire on June 15th. Strengthening these rent laws will stop landlord abuse of the laws as they currently stand due to harassment of tenants, lack of repairs, excessive rent increases, and many more abuses. These abuses have caused the loss of over 400,000 rent-stabilized apartments and attributing to the increase in homelessness. As we get closer to this time, we are making our more frequent trips to Albany to make our voices heard and to make sure the elected officials in this know that we are not to be deterred in this fight for decent housing, which is a human right. Our biggest tenant victory in decades, stronger rent laws to protect the right to decent, affordable housing in our communities. Please join us tomorrow, May 14, 2019, for our biggest mass rally to Albany to demand that rent laws be strengthened and passed to protect our homes. Anyone here that is interested in joining us, see one of the Flatbush Tenant Coalition members for details. And again, we thank you for this honor.
Tenant power! Tenant power! Thank you.
Tenant photo.
Thank you.
So we're usually running late, so we're running 15 minutes ahead. So we would like to invite the panelists to come up. Everybody's here, but the panelists who are here, please join us up on the podium. They're doing a long speech.
Okay. Out. Inside, just inside. Yeah. Good? Yeah, she'll be fine.
Um, So we're gonna be asking, basically, two questions today. Why is it so hard for tenants to get repairs with housing court, and what can we do about it? The panel today is made up, as, probably most of you recognize, some, tenant attorneys, some tenant leaders, an organizer, one organizer, and some people, former organizers. So we're gonna have an array of opinions on what can be done to change housing court. We're gonna start out with a presentation by Nicole Summers. Nicole is a clinical instructor in the housing law clinic at Harvard Law School, where she supervises second and third year law students representing low-income tenants facing eviction. Nicole is a legal fellow at the NYU Furman Center and a staff attorney at the Bronx Defenders. And then the other panelists following, I'm just doing this in alphabetical order. Otter can decide who talks first and who talks last. Michael Grinthal is a supervising attorney in the Community Development Project at the Urban Justice Center. He worked previously at South Brooklyn Legal Services and at MFJ Legal Services. Before becoming a lawyer, Michael worked as a community organizer. Erin Neff is a staff attorney at the Legal Aid Society, where she represents people who are going through eviction proceedings in Brooklyn. Erin also works with other organizations, including the Democratic Socialists of America, to assist with tenant organizing and trainings. Beverly Newsom is the Tenant Association president at Ebbets Field, Brooklyn, where she works with her neighbors to stop harassment and displacement. She's a tenant leader with Flatbush Tenant Coalition, Met Council on Housing, and other tenants' rights group. She's also chairperson of the Housing Committee for Community Ward 9 in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. Nestle Paul is a tenant leader and steering committee member with the Flatbush Tenant Coalition. In 2012, he founded a tenant association in his building together with other tenant leaders, winning hundreds of repairs and empowering his neighbors to fight for their rights. He is the lead member of FTC's Stronger Rent Laws Committee and the Housing Court Reform Committee, including Right to Counsel. Aga Trojniak, who will moderate the panel, is the director and co-founder of the Flatbush Tenant Coalition. Prior to her work with the coalition, Ms. Trojniak served as the director of housing and immigration programs at the Flatbush Tenant Development Corporation. She was an advanced community organizing fellow with the Center for Neighborhood Leadership, and in 2015, she received the New York City Shirley Chisholm Women of Distinction Award for her work with the coalition. She holds a Master of Urban Planning degree from Hunter College. So please welcome. Nicole's gonna go first.
Hi, thanks everyone for having me and giving me the opportunity to present the results of my research. I'll first just say that I developed the idea to do this study when I was working at the Bronx Defenders as a tenant attorney and found that it was, as you all are of course experiencing, very, very difficult to get repairs made in my clients' homes, very difficult to get rent abatements, even where tenants had terrible conditions, had faced real financial expenditures because of those conditions. And I wanted to see sort of how widespread that experience was and what the system was looking like overall. So the goals of the study that I conducted were sort of fourfold. So first I wanted to understand whether and to what extent tenants with what I'm calling meritorious warranty habitability claims, sorry that's very clunky language, I'll explain what that means, but to what extent basically tenants who have really bad conditions in their properties receive rent abatements. So tenants who should be getting rent abatements because they've had bad conditions, when are they actually getting them? And this is all in the context of non-payment of rent eviction cases. Second, I wanted to see whether and to what extent tenants who have those types of claims are getting some other types of benefits. So if they're avoiding judgments of possession to the landlord, or if they're getting longer repayment periods because they have these claims, so if they're benefiting in some other way as they should under the law. Third, I wanted to look at how much lawyers need to make a difference in these outcomes, whether to what extent a lawyer mattered. And fourth, I wanted to see whether tenants are able to successfully secure repairs in the context of these non-payment cases. So I'm just going to give a very brief overview of the methodology, but I'm happy to talk more about it with anyone who's interested after. So the main sort of things to know are first that I looked at eviction case files from, that were filed in 2016, just because at the time that I was doing the study, that was the closest time period for which the files were fully available. I looked at over 1,200 non-payment of rent cases across all 5 boroughs. One thing that's not on the slide is that I also matched these case files at the address and unit level with the HPD records for those properties, so to see whether there was an open code violation at the time, whether the tenant had or anyone else had complained to HPD either 6 months after the case was filed or 6 months before. I coded all the information contained in the case file, so there were like 18 different criteria, but some of the bigger ones were whether the tenant got an abatement, whether there was repairs in the settlement agreement, or the stipulation, whether the tenant was represented, things like that. And then I tried to identify which cases appear to have what I'm calling meritorious warranty compatibility claims, basically meaning that the tenant should have been entitled to some rent abatement, rent reduction, should have gotten repairs in the case because they had bad conditions. I did that in 3 different ways. I'm just giving an overview. You don't have to sort of absorb all of this, but the first way was just whether there were what I'm calling substantial repairs in the initial stipulation. So, a big repair, something like, the heat being out, there being major leaks, not things like the towel rack being broken. The second definition I used was whether there were substantial repairs included in multiple settlement stipulations in the case, and there were repairs asserted to be needed when the tenant filed their answer. And then the third definition I used is whether there were open Class B or Class C HPD violations at the unit at the time the case was filed. So the reason why I used 3 different definitions was just sort of to test with my own methodology to make sure that I'm identifying cases the proper way, since we don't really know, what exactly was going on at the property. These are all various ways to sort of get there. So often when I talk about the results, I talk about a bit of a range of possible outcomes. So the first question that I had was, how often tenants with these claims actually receive rent abatements? So whether they receive some reduction in the rent owed because of the bad conditions. And what I found was that that's happening very, very rarely. I'm sure it's not a shock to you all. Somewhere between 3 and 9% of tenants with these claims are actually getting a rent abatement. One thing that I thought was interesting was that tenants were much, much more likely to get a rent abatement where there were open B or C code violations in the unit, which is not a requirement to get a rent abatement, but probably my guess is that it's looking like that's a more sort of valid claim, even though that's not part of the law. Then the last was just that, the last point I think is sort of important is that tenants who do not appear to have any conditions issues aren't getting rent abatements. And this is sometimes things that landlords' attorneys will say is that, tenants are just making things up and they're just trying to get rent abatements even where they're not entitled to them, but the data doesn't bear that out at all. No tenants who don't have bad conditions are somehow getting these rent abatements. It's really, really mostly tenants who have these open code violations who are getting them at all. And it's still very, very few of the ones who should be getting them actually are. The second question I had was whether tenants who have these types of claims, who have bad conditions in their property, are getting some other benefit in their case because of the claim. So maybe they're not getting a rent abatement, but they're instead sort of using their right to a rent abatement to negotiate some other good outcome in their case. Like What they really want is more time to pay the arrears. They really want to avoid a judgment with the landlord. So I wanted to sort of explore that possibility. And what I found is that that's not happening at all. That the outcomes of tenants, of cases of tenants who have bad conditions look just the same as tenants who don't have bad conditions. They're not, from a statistical standpoint, benefiting in any way other than by receiving rent abatements. So the third question was whether those findings are just a result of tenants not having counsel. Again, this was in 2016 before right to counsel had been passed. So there were some lawyers in the system, but not nearly as many as there are today. And what I found is that legal representation does matter, and it matters quite a lot, but that it's not fully explaining what's going on. That tenants who had these meritorious claims, who should have been getting rent abatements, were between 3 and 9 times more likely to receive them when they had a lawyer. So that's a pretty big impact, I think. But still, most tenants who should have gotten rent abatements didn't get them at all. Still 75%, about 75% of tenants who had bad conditions in the property, who should have gotten rent abatements, didn't get them even when they had a lawyer. And finally, the last question that I looked at was whether the warranty habitabilities of the law that supposedly protects tenants in non-payment of rent cases or sort of provides this tool for making repairs, whether it's actually working that way. Whether when basically tenants put in stipulations, landlord will make repairs on X date, that's actually happening. So what I found is that, and this probably isn't a surprise, that in about half of all cases, there are some substantial repairs included in the initial stipulation. Again, those are sort of big repairs, not minor cosmetic things, things that really affect the tenant's use of the property. So that's happening in about half of all cases, which seems like a really good thing that that's going into the stipulation. However, it appears that in about 70% of those cases, the repairs actually aren't getting made. And the way that I determined that was I looked at the cases where there were multiple stipulations, so the tenant had come back to court in order to show cause perhaps, or for some other reason, the case ended up back in court. There was a second stipulation, and the exact same repairs were included in the second stipulation, even though the access dates had passed in the first stipulation. So basically, the first stipulation, let's say it was today, said, landlord's going to make all these repairs on May 31st. Tenant comes back in June, and then in June, the stipulation says that the exact same repairs are going to be made, even though those dates have passed. So that I saw as an indication that when the repairs are being put into the settlement agreements, that landlords aren't actually complying with their obligations. The other thing I will say that's not up here that I did look at is that I was really curious about how judges were using their authority to order HPD inspections or request them. And I found that was happening very, very rarely, according to what's in the case file. Only in about 1% of all non-payment of rent cases are judges actually ordering HPD inspections. And where there have been no code violations, there are no code violations at the time of the case filing, and the tenant has not yet complained to HPD, but the tenant is putting substantial repairs in the agreement, so they're reporting that there are ongoing problems. In only 0.4% of those cases are the judges ordering an HPD inspection. So they're really not using that tool, even though it's one that's available to them. So those are the sort of big picture results. I'm happy to share the paper with anyone who's interested, or if you have any thoughts you'd like to share, I would love to hear them. So that's my contact information.
Thank you very much for that data. I think this is information that every tenant advocate, every tenant lawyer already knows, but I think it is extremely powerful to have this data and this research to back up what we all know needs to be fixed. It's a little a little shocking, even though I've read through the report, to actually hear those numbers being spoken out. So I think what we're going to do is, if folks on the panel have comments or any points that they would like to make about repairs enforcement in general, but especially as it pertains to this data and to the newly passed right to counsel legislation, maybe we can start with those comments, and then we will take questions from the audience or comments from the audience, and I think that's probably where we're going to get some real substantial ideas for how we address this. So is there anybody on the panel that would like to start? Beverly.
One of the things when I was listening to the paper, I wanted, for those of you forgotten, I'm the president of the tennis organization of Evansfield. Evansfield is 1,300 apartments. So that's an extremely good sample size, is how I look at it. So as I was listening to the paper, I wanted to hear, are there any examples in there that I don't see? Right on down to where she mentioned she does a comparison to how many judges ask for the repairs to be made. I've been in housing court with a tenant who has needed repairs for over a year. She's going back and forth to court for non-payment of rent, and the judge never mentions getting the repairs done. She's standing in front of the judge demanding that they haven't fixed this, they haven't fixed that, and the judge goes, okay, so are you going to address those repairs by the time we come back to court? Landlord goes, yes. 3 days later, they go back to court, the repairs still aren't done. So there's nothing to, and I think in large part is due, and this is just my opinion, real estate is this part of real estate is the only industry where there seems to be no oversight, given there are large dollar amounts. Most industry, if you don't do what you're supposed to do, you don't get paid. In real estate, in renting, you cannot do repairs and the tenant still be evicted for non-payment. That shouldn't be. You can still evict a tenant for, even though your records, your accounting records, your billing system is off. This is the only industry where that can happen. Other industries, if your billing system is off, you have to bring it up to date. It has to be accurate, and you have to prove its accuracy before anything can be moved forward. This is not that. So those are some of the things as I'm listening to her paper, I'm like, okay, I need to hear something that we're not experiencing. We're experiencing everything in her paper, in addition to other things. That's my comment.
Thank you, Beverly. Erin?
So when it comes to repairs cut into profits. Housing is a profit-driven industry. It's not really about providing a home for people. It's not really about providing safety. It's not about providing a service. Landlords don't buy property to be a social worker, to help people. They buy it to make money. And particularly when we're talking about rent-stabilized housing where profits, where landlords get more concerned about profits because the rent is limited, we see tenants who are long-term residents, 30 plus years, their family has lived there, they have the worst conditions of their apartment because one, the landlord's trying to kick them out so they can deregulate the apartment, and two, that apartment is less profitable for them now because they can't raise the rent. So what are they going to do? They're going to not do the repairs so that they can increase their profits. And the one thing I wanted to touch on with the sort of the lack of abatement, I think it's really important to, when we're talking about tenant advocates, to not only think about how do we increase our power as tenants, how do we fight for justice, but also understanding the limitations of the systems that we're working in. So Housing Court was developed to make it easier to evict people, make it easier for landlords to get money through a summary proceeding rather than going through civil court. And the way abatements work is you have to have all the money on essentially your first court date or when you go to trial in order to get an abatement. You have a trial or you have an abatement hearing, and then at the end of that, the judge might decide, okay, this is a 10% abatement, so now pay the rest of your rent within 5 days. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of tenants are coming to court. Sometimes tenants are withholding their rent to have an abatement, and then they have all the rent ready. But a lot of tenants do owe some sort of money, and there's stuff like one-shot deals and charities that will help provide that money, but you usually can't get that money in time for an abatement hearing. So if you have an abatement hearing without having all that money, and then you might be awarded abatement, but you don't have that money ready to pay over, then you will be evicted. So in balancing the pros and cons of that, either as a lawyer or as a tenant, most people aren't going to pursue an abatement. And I think, again, that the way that system works of getting an abatement is designed to benefit landlords and not tenants. Because if you haven't had heat, there should be no ifs, ands, or buts. Your rent should be abated. But you go through this rigorous process. Tenants have to take days off of work, making it harder to pay their rent. And all this seeks to benefit the landlord and leads to less abatements for tenants.
Thank you, Erin. I'm gonna say a few words, and if anybody else wants to. Yeah, Mr. Paul, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, okay, I know RTC is a victory. RTC is a victory. And there's more for us to get, you know. But even though it appears like that, but still we cannot be to go in place. You know, the landlord will choose any way possible to do eviction. It's for us to get together and protect them. It's not the end. The reason why I say that, even imagine someone who is working. They've been doing this with people that are working. To them, the lawyers are really difficult. It's a lot of lawyers, calls for the member. Now, what's going to happen if a tenant is working and he or she is facing eviction? The landlord will use that thing to evade the tenant by giving multiple appointments. And will the tenant be able to attend all the time? And he or she has to work. That's the situation that would be presented down in the collapse. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Paul. So, yeah, right to counsel, as Mr. Paul rightfully says, was a victory. It's a huge victory, right? We know that it makes a huge difference in terms of evictions, right? And I just want us to appreciate the moment for a second, because what we're talking about now is this victory that we thought for so long that we would never ever see. We're now talking about how we can build on this victory, right? To really build tenant power, to get repairs, to stop the harassment, right? So we know we can, right, move mountains, right? We've done it. And the question is, how do we move this mountain now, right? And we are going to do it, because after the Stronger Rent Laws fight, June 15th, I think we are all looking forward to that a lot. But I do think we've already seen with our tenant leaders and the conversations that we've had that the focus is going to really return back to the issue of repairs enforcement, stopping other types of harassment. Hopefully some of that pressure will ease as a result of the changes in the rent laws, but we know it's not going to go away, right? So this is gonna be our focus, moving forward, right? Really thinking about how do we make repairs happen in housing court, outside of housing court, all of that. And so I think at the crux of all of this, at bottom, the question really is like, what teeth does housing court have, right? Or, you know, even if they're covered up and we can't see them, right? And what's happening that those teeth aren't biting, right? And so I think, you know, obviously, for tenants in housing court, especially when, you know, as we know, there's power in numbers and there's group cases, you know, contempt and penalties, which are not used enough, right? We know that penalties and fines are hardly collected, right? So that's like a whole other issue. They're not collected. Contempt is very rarely pursued, right? And in part, this is because tenants without representation, like Mr. Paul said and other folks have said, it's too much. I mean, how many times are you gonna go back to court before you just give up, right? Because every time you go back to court is a day you have to take off work. It's a day you're losing money, you're losing time, you're getting stressed out, all of that, right? So I think right to counsel, you know, is a huge opportunity, right? Tenants who are in non-payment cases, even individually, are with their attorneys. Hopefully, we will be able to, you know, pursue contempt, penalties, things of that sort. I know that there are a lot of capacity issues around right to counsel, and we need to address that, right? But we are, you know, together with the lawyers, allies in this fight, and I think, you know, we need to talk about those capacity issues honestly and figure out how we're going to deal with them. But I think, you know, with progress on those issues, we're going to be able to use and just really start pushing some of the teeth that there actually are, right, to get repairs so that tenants can get repairs. One of the ways that we're already seeing RTC actually make a difference with respect to repairs is in the context of rent reductions issued by DHCR, for example, right? So as a matter of, you know, just standard procedure, whenever we organize a tenant association and there's repair issues, one of the first things we do, the group files for rent reductions from DHCR, right? Repair issues, you're entitled to a rent reduction. The rent stays frozen at that lower level until DHCR says that the repairs have been addressed, right? And DHCR has weirdly higher standards than HPD for like what kind of work counts as fixing something. So especially with leaks and things like that, so that's a good thing, although that bar is very low. But so, you know, we would get these rent reductions and then tenants would be afraid to actually claim them because the landlord is not gonna reflect them on the rent invoices, right? And people were afraid to take them because they were afraid of ending up in housing court. And we've already had tenant associations where we, you know, do this as a group where folks are now comfortable taking those rent reductions because they know that should they end up in housing court, they will be represented, and that makes a huge difference, you know, in ensuring that they're not going to get evicted in the whole mess that is housing court, right? And just one other thing that I wanted to mention in terms of teeth, and this is something that I know Mike and the Flatbush Tenant Coalition have talked about before, and other things as well, and Larry mentioned it today, which got me going, which is the rent impairing violations, right? So one of the issues with with the fines, as we already mentioned, is that nobody collects them. Like, it's an astounding amount of money that is owed to the city just from fines that are actually levied against landlords for housing code violations. And so just like, that's a small fraction of what the city should be getting, right? And so what we've talked about in the past is, fighting to change legislation so that that money actually goes, those fines actually go to the tenants, right? As opposed to the city, whatever part of the city that they currently go to. And rent impairing violations, I feel like are actually sort of like an in-between kind of opportunity, right? So these are violations. So how many folks here are tenants who are here to represent their tenant association or all the FTC folks? For sure. Yes. So these are violations, right, that if they are on the HPD record for 6 months or longer and please correct me, anybody, if I'm not explaining this correctly, but if they're on the record 6 months or longer, from that time period, from the 6-month mark, you actually have a right to just not, to withhold your entire rent, and not just withhold it, but you get 100% abatement for that time period after the 6 months, okay? It's 100% abatement. This includes conditions like no heat, no hot water, which are sometimes, hard to get on the HPD violations list, but it also includes things that we see all the time, like rodents and improper locks on exits to the roof, things like that. There's lots of stuff on there that we can, we see all the time, we can definitely work with, right? So, one thing we've been thinking about is it's a list of maybe 40 or so violations, something like that. Why isn't it every Class C violation, right? Maybe every Class B violation even, right? I mean, how many of you have seen those HPD violation reports where there's violations from 1999, right? That actually, where the conditions still actually exist, right? So I think if we think about, using these types of tools, especially in the context of tenant associations where you're working with a group, that can have a huge impact, an actual impact that the landlord will care about, right? I think those are ways that we can potentially push, repairs where right to counsel is creates a space for us to do that in a way that we wouldn't have been able to do that before, right? So, all right, that's my 2 cents. And I know that.
Yeah, I muted it when I sat up here, and now I don't know how to use it. My name again is Mike Obama. I'm a lawyer at the Community Development Project at the Urban Justice Center. And as a lawyer, I spend a lot of time sort of with my face very close to housing court, and very close to the system, and see a lot of details and see in the moment by moment why the things are true that Nicole was describing and that everyone in this room knows is true. And as a lawyer, I have ideas. I have places we could fix, we could change the law here, we could change the rules there. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But before I do that lawyer thing of talking about all the amendments we could make, I wanted to take this opportunity of being in this room with all of you away from the day-to-day fight to try to think of some of the big truths here. And to think about housing court as an institution of power that obeys all the same rules and all the same dynamics that any institution does, that a law school does, that a church does, that a government agency does, that my organization does. And to think about how we change those things, And I think we don't think about housing court often enough as an institution. We often think of it as a set of laws, as a set of procedures. There's kind of something at the center of housing court, this magic that judges do that we hold back from. That we think that's special, that's different from the way all other institutions work. But like Aga was saying, this unbelievable victory of right to counsel, this really sort of historic victory has changed and can change housing court as an institution. And it already has in one simple way by changing who's there, who's in the room, in the building. And that can't help but change the institution to some extent. We all talked before right to counsel, we're talking now about how that changes the culture of housing court. And I don't want to minimize that. Again, an institution is made up of people, and so it depends who's there. And right to counsel fundamentally changes who is in the room and who is in the hallways. And it's going to change. And it's going to change housing court. And housing court is going to change us back, which we know, and which I don't think comes as news to anybody. But there are still people who aren't there, right? Who does it put more of in housing court? It puts more of us. It puts more of me in housing court. And that's very important. But there's still a lot of people missing from housing court. And what I'm about to say is probably going to sound strange. It's hard for me to say it, but we need more tenants in housing court. And not there as respondents, but how are tenants going to be in housing court as part of running housing court? I don't know. I don't have the answer, but I think to me that's the central question, right? Because until tenants are there, until people from the community are there, then there's something fundamental not changing about the institution, right? I do want to get on for a moment to the little, they're not so little, but the lawyer stuff, just because this is what I think about, probably like a lot of you. Every time I don't win in housing court, every time I'm frustrated in housing court, every time, I on the subway home, this is what I think about, and housing court answers invited me up here, so I'm gonna talk about that stuff. But there are some, in light of the fact that the right to counsel movement has built an enormous amount of power and has built a base of power that can't go away because of all of the people now who are part of it and all of us who get money from it. That's a base of power to build on. And because we're facing, again, historic opportunities at the state level that nobody here needs me to tell you about, we have a chance to think about the law in ways that would have been, that were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when we were thinking about this, that just weren't winnable or realistic. And some of the things we can think about are, because most of what happens in housing court is state law. And people have been very resourceful about changing the city laws. But most of what happens in housing court is state law. And some things we could do with state law, for example, would be, we know that all of the bad outcomes in housing court are affected by the fact that housing court is massively overburdened. That because it's massively overburdened, there's no time to do the things that need to be done. So if a tenant has repairs in their eviction case, everybody is thinking, I don't have time for that. The judge is thinking, I just want to go over the stipulation. I just want to mark this case done. The tenant's attorney is thinking, I just need to make sure this person's safe and not going to get evicted. HPD in the HP part is thinking, I've got way too many cases for me to pay close attention to. Right? As long as the place is a middle, then the things we want aren't going to happen there. if we had a state law that said, it was part of the state law that says there was a maximum number of cases per day that could be on in any housing courtroom, well, then either everything would have to massively slow down, including mostly eviction cases, or the state would have to pay for a lot more housing court judges and a lot more resources. That's the actual price of having due process and justice. We're not paying it now. We've chosen what the real estate industry and what the landlord want to use housing court for, which is to make sure things move quickly. And it's the tenants who aren't chosen. But if, for example, you could guarantee that you get some time in front of the judge, if you could guarantee that you get a good amount of time with your lawyer, if you could guarantee, for example, that evictions are just going to have to move as slowly as they have to move, and the tenant wasn't that close to the buzzsaw, then maybe we could assert warranty of habitability a bit more. Maybe we wouldn't always be operating from such a defensive posture. I think also one of the things that we've always talked about, I think everybody here has probably talked about it, conditioning payment of arrears on the repairs being done. I think we all know what it looks like. You get a stipulation that says you've got 30 days to pay, and the landlord's supposed to come next Thursday to do the repairs. And one of those things is important and enforced, and one of those things is just some fine print at the bottom of the stamp. And that's because of the law, because the housing court, like Aaron said, is there to evict people. And you can attach things along the way, but in the end, it's there to evict people. So until we change that law, if, for example, the law said, if you've got violations of record, then you can't collect on any arrears judgment until you've shown HPD that they are gone. That would in any event, so I think we are thinking on two levels here. One is the big systems, the institution. The other is where are the different places in the course of a case where we run into a barrier, where things go wrong, and fixing those things. So let's keep thinking on both of those levels.
Thank you, Mike. Any other comments from the panel before we move to